This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the next hour, we'll run through all the business stories you need to know about from across Africa and beyond. But first, a quick run through the markets here for you. So let's start in Kenya. Absa subsidiary in the country and Kenya Airways both released their first quarter and full year results respectively. Annual losses of the carrier nearly doubled for the second consecutive annual loss, over $121 million in the red. Its shares were the third most heavily traded today, but they fell by just under 22%. That's the biggest one-day loss they've had since 2017. We'll also have part of a conversation with the Absa Kenya Managing Director in the next 15 minutes. What direction will that loan portfolio go in? We'll have those details shortly. Here's what's coming up tonight. The Kenya-Uganda border reopens for cargo trucks after weeks of closure. China's political season wraps up with plans to eradicate poverty and renew prosperity for all citizens. And we'll give you a taste of the Western Cape's eco-friendly wine produced in South Africa. Plenty to get through tonight, but let's start with the business of trade in East Africa. Officials from both Kenya and Uganda have now started to clear a 50-kilometer-long queue of trucks at the country's respective border. That snarl-up has built up over the last couple of days due to delays over coronavirus testing. Kenya's Cabinet Secretary for the East African Community, Aden Mohammed, now says that all the outstanding issues between the two sides have been addressed. CGTN's Wilkista Nyabwa starts us off tonight.
The queues of trucks at the Kenya-Uganda border in Malaba stretch out into the distance in a snarl-up that built up over time. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, it would take truck drivers just 3 days to drive from the port of Mombasa to Kampala and back. The amount of time drivers now take on this trip has doubled due to the measures introduced to curb the spread of the virus. In the face of an unfolding crisis at the border, John Macharia, Kenya's Transport Cabinet Secretary, and Aden Mohammed, the Cabinet Secretary for the East African Community and Regional Development, sought to resolve the problem. They attributed the problem to a number of disgruntled truck drivers.
We have had issues that have developed, largely a creation of our own truck drivers that has caused a 50-kilometer long delay of trucks that is now becoming a security threat.
We have put measures in place to open the border, and we have told those people who are causing problems that you do not have to drive towards the border. If you feel you have grievances in terms of you entering Uganda, then don't leave your point of departure. Don't collect cargo in Mombasa, don't collect cargo in Nairobi, heading to the border only for you to go there and cause confusion. That we said we will not accept.
The truck drivers have also complained that they have been subjected to multiple painful COVID-19 tests before they are allowed across the border.
They must get the COVID-free certificate, the COVID-19 free certificate, 48 hours before commencement of the journey. With that, upon getting to the border, you don't have to wait. It will be an express way.
Efforts to clear the queue of trucks at the Malaba border point have since commenced. It will take about 5 days to clear the backlog. Officials at the border point have been asked to work round the clock to ensure that the situation is resolved. The snarl-up at the Malaba border has hugely affected the transport of cargo from the port of Mombasa to other East Africa community countries that depend on it. Wilkista Nyabwa, CGTN.
All right, then, so let's dig a little deeper into this development with Felix Okach. He's an expert on multilateral trade. He joins us now live on the line. Thank you for your time this evening, sir. So all of May, we've seen queues of trucks, tens of kilometers long, building up at the Kenya-Uganda border. Should traders expect this to be just the new normal, or are there ways of cutting this backlog while still ensuring that truck drivers are adequately tested for COVID-19?
Thank you very much for that question. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
You know, East African countries in 1999, we signed East African Community Treaty. And in that treaty, we took into account that we got historical differences, commercially we're together, cultural differences, and we need to have a mutual relationship doing business together. We should have a peaceful coexistence. So the ultimate thing is that agreement of East African Community was ignored by the minister going to the border to talk about drivers not opening, not behaving well. Because in terms of trade, goods and services move across the border, and there are World Trade Organization regulations. EAC have signed regional agreements to show how these things should be moving. When a disease occurs, an epidemic, there's something in trade called sanitary and phytosanitary standards. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
A country can take a measure, but when you take a measure, you include the other party on what you're doing. In this case, when COVID issue started, the testing had a lot of challenges and questions. So much so that the truck drivers from Namanga complained that all of them were tested positive in Kenya. The Kenyans talked of using a different test rather than what was expected the other side. So the bad advice given to our president by the cabinet secretary was to close the border, and he closed the border. And Tanzania retaliated, which means we did not sit down in advance and see that we are together, we need to solve this thing together. Because the disease is dangerous to all of us. So that was the cause. And now saying that trucks are moving, it is us who have caused that problem. Because normally when a problem occurs, policymakers have regulations, they've got certain agreements, they have certain standards, then you test in a normal way. And when I talk about SPS, that is sanitary and phytosanitary standards, each country, when you're putting a standard, it must be scientific and acceptable and known that this thing will work.
So would it be fair to say that at this point in time, all three countries, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, essentially adopting the exact same testing methodology, and that will remove all of these issues about different results showing up depending on who's doing the testing?
It came late in testing because initially the equipment were not there, and the results were coming up in varied ways. You remember the case of Namanga, when in Kenya argued that they were doing a deeper testing than what Tanzanians were doing. But normally when it's testing, it should be one standard method of testing for all. And that should have been done immediately to make sure the business continued. But we waited until we came to this scenario.
Right. We're going to get back to the Tanzania question in just a moment. But this does seem to be a prime opportunity for rail traffic to essentially take over some of the cargo movement between the port of Mombasa, for example, and Kampala. But that's not really happening. Why?
The cargo from Mombasa goes to the dry port in Naivasha. It does not go across to Uganda. So you talk of getting goods from dry port and then into Uganda. In Tanzania, it's a different story. But when you look at trade, Ramah Nyang, look at Kenya is losing in this scenario because Kenya's biggest trading partner in the world, apart from Europe, is Uganda. 61 billion worth of goods per year. That was 2019 Kenya Bureau statistics. In Tanzania, it's 28 billion. So those are the greatest markets for us, which means when it occurred, we would have made sure we sit together and agree on a framework of testing and movement of goods. But the loss has been solved just because of bad policy decisions.
There have been proposals, as you mentioned a little earlier, to shut down that Kenya-Tanzania border. Assuming this sort of thing does happen, let's just explore the worst-case scenario. What effect would it have other than stopping the nearly $70 million of exports that we had into Tanzania in the first quarter?
That's question, Ramah Nyang. But you see, when you look at the Kenya-Tanzania border, I'll start from historical perspective. All of us are speaking one language, Swahili and English. Two, there are local communities who are affected by this colonial border. If you go to Isebania, there are the Luos on the other side and this other side. You come to, and also the Koreans. You come to Namanga, the Maasai on this side and the other side. You come to Taveta, the same, and Lunga, which meant that you cannot make a unilateral decision to close a border. And if you do, at WTO level, somebody can accuse you that you took a measure without informing them. That's why worldwide we inform measures which are going to take. And the three countries had an agreement, ESC Treaty, which talks of being mutual respecting one another, having peaceful coexistence, and settling disputes. We even have East African Legislative Council, but we decided to take a unilateral measure, which is the cause of those things.
But couldn't the counter-argument be made that, look, if Tanzania is not doing as much consistent and widespread testing for COVID-19 purely on public health and safety grounds, there is a case to be made to close that border until those conditions in Tanzania change?
The measure we would take is say, at the border, this is a test we are applying. If a driver does not meet those tests, he does not get into the country. And I'm sure there were some Tanzanians who are not tested positive. Because when you say all the 51 drivers were positive, scientifically, the sample you've taken, there's something, you are raising more questions. So we would say the border measure is that if you are tested positive, you stay for a while, you don't come in. So they would have said allowed only the ones who would come in. But you see, when you close the border suddenly, the ripple effect Ramah Nyang was heavy. In the market at Gikomba market, Mudurwa, a lot of goods didn't come in. Some people had paid for fruits, paid for other things.
Because Kenya is reliant on Tanzania for some fresh produce, right?
Yes, quite a lot fresh produce and maize and many other things. So some businessmen had even paid in advance, and all these things went bad, which meant we made a decision without due concern of what's on that ground.
All right, so we'll have to leave it there for the time being. Mr. Felix Okach, a multilateral trade expert, thank you very much for your time this evening. Much appreciated. Now then, let's move on in the program. Despite many countries grounding flights because of the COVID-19 pandemic, Ethiopia's national carrier has chosen to remain in the skies. 3 months after the virus hit the continent, Ethiopian Airlines is now one of the main connections between Africa and other continents on the planet. It's also been transporting much-needed medical supplies donated from a various range of sources. Here's CGTN's Coletta Wanjohi with this report.
Mahi Ismail is at the Bole International Airport in Addis Ababa to receive his consignment from China. His company is donating these medical supplies to the Ministry of Health to assist in fighting the COVID-19 pandemic.
Our Chinese partners also have, a big step in Ethiopia, and they want to help Ethiopia. So we collaborated together, and they are the ones who arranged all the, purchases and all the logistics in China to get all this equipment for Ethiopia. So it's a good example of how, not only within our company, but it can help the whole country from China.
In another wing of the cargo section, humanitarian workers are sorting out medical supplies. They have been donated by the Jackma Foundation to be distributed to African nations.
This is almost today more than 20 countries. We are about to ship all to member states, and more than 13 type of commodities, health supply commodities, including ventilators, PPE, thermometer scan, and also some screening materials.
All these consignments are being shipped by Ethiopian Airlines. Originally, cargo transportation accounted for less than 20% of the airline's business, with only 10 cargo aircrafts. But amid the coronavirus pandemic, the company has become the biggest cargo carrier to and from the continent.
Ethiopian Airlines was quick and agile, flexible to move to cargo. All its attention, management attention, focus, resources, energy. We have also retrained people from the passenger side to cargo. We have also removed passenger seats from our passenger airplanes so that we can use for cargo, about 22 of them. So effectively, we have more than doubled our cargo capacity. That is why today we are managing the crisis within our own resources. We have not taken money from anyone, from any external sources. We have not also borrowed liquidity from any banks.
The airline says China remains a major client for its cargo business.
As you know, there are a lot of projects going on in Africa, and these projects are Chinese investment or joint venture investment. So it would have affected the African economies significantly if suddenly the link was discontinued. So even now, In most African countries, you go to the airport, you see Ethiopian Airlines airplane, maybe alone. But we are still delivering medical supplies and also key industrial imports and also our African exports to Europe, Middle East and Asia.
But the company is not looking at cargo as a profit-making venture. Despite the increase in cargo business, the airline says it might suffer a loss of at least $1 billion by June because of the sharp decline in passenger ticket sales. Normally, Ethiopian Airlines flies to more than 100 international destinations. It is currently only operating 10 of these routes. But once the pandemic comes to an end and airspaces reopen, the airline is confident that it will be resuming passenger flights within the continent and beyond. Coletta Njohi, CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
All right, then a quick run through some company news now. Starting in South Africa, Woolworths is set to review its Australasian property assets as the retailer is battling the tough impact of this pandemic on consumer spending. This comes after the company scrapped its 2020 dividend. The toll of the outbreak has seen turnover and concession sales falling by at least 18.5% as of the 26th of April, and that has sent its shares down by nearly 5%. Elsewhere, business rescue practitioners for South African Airways have dismissed claims that the carrier could resume flights in the middle of June. This comes after the airline published a statement saying it would retain its current domestic schedule between Johannesburg and Cape Town under level 3 of the country's lockdown. Egypt Air is also expected to temporarily pay 75% of its flying crew salaries in the local currency and the remaining 25% in US dollars. That decision comes amid the impact of COVID-19, which has stopped operations entirely across most of the global aviation sector. And finally, Renault, Nissan and Mitsubishi Motor Corporation have scrapped off their decades-old strategy to form a combined alliance. It's an attempt to slash costs and preserve an alliance that's been hit pretty hard by this pandemic. This comes after the arrest in 2018 and the subsequent ousting of its chairman and chief architect of that alliance, Carlos Ghosn. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Here's what's coming up shortly. We'll be looking at what lies ahead for ABSA Kenya amidst the coronavirus pandemic. And we look at China's assessment of investment potential across the continent, even as COVID-19 dims prospects for some countries.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra. Hello, Naro.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
There's more to this place than just glorious landscapes. There's more to it than just, say, Table Mountain or glorious, endless salt flats. There's more to it than countries that are home to some of the deepest mines in the world. There is so much more to this place, even if it is home to some of the finest diamonds on the planet. It is the sheer diversity of the people who call Southern Africa home and the relentless drive to make it a better place that make it so special. And we know that because this too is home. No one knows Southern Africa like we do. CGTN, see the difference.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. Despite its many challenges, Africa as a whole does remain a fairly solid investment opportunity. The continent is poised for growth, both in population and through its resources. China does continue to see that potential. The Asian giant has invested heavily in developing countries across the continent. CGTN's Sumitra Naidu with the details.
Infrastructure remains one of the biggest challenges facing countries in Africa. Limited power supply has become a barrier to economic growth and poverty reduction on the continent.
I think for Africa to achieve its Agenda 2063, it requires more energy. And energy needs to be planned not just for now. All African countries need to plan energy for the next 10 to 50 years, ensure that it goes with economic growth as well as population.
According to global data, there's 242 power projects in development across Africa. These projects have a total investment value of over $313 billion. China has invested in more than half of these projects.
This continent is a place where Chinese companies can compete with global companies, where they can get that international exposure, where they can help secure energy supply for China and diversify the resources that China needs, but also to get involved across the value chain.
The African Development Bank says the continent's infrastructure needs are estimated at between $130 and $170 billion, providing further investment opportunities.
We are aware of energy plans that are ongoing in Zimbabwe with its own economic challenges. I think there's an upgrade of Kariba and energy in that country. And then Zambia has had quite a number of energy projects that are online, done by the China and Zambian government.
While infrastructure development is growing in Africa, South Africa is stalling. Corruption and mismanagement has left the only power supplier in the country with mounting debt and eroding infrastructure.
China is the country that has the financial and technical expertise to help South Africa realize a just energy transition. There is the question of how we transition away from coal to other sources of energy, how we protect those jobs. Very centralized mode of production where Eskom is responsible for pretty much everything is probably not going to work anymore.
Many are still waiting to see the plan to save Eskom. In the meantime, load shedding will be reintroduced in the coming weeks as we head into winter. For those businesses that are reopening since the lockdown, it's another expense that they cannot afford. Many experts believe it's time that South Africa open up this industry to new players. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
All right, then a bit of breaking news for you coming out of Canada. A court over there has just released a decision on the hearing of Meng Wanzhou's case. That's a Huawei CFO. As you might recall, the judge has ruled that the U.S. extradition case against Huawei's chief financial officer can advance. Now, earlier on, China's foreign ministry said the U.S. and Canada had, in their view, abused their bilateral extradition treaty and arbitrarily took compulsory measures against a Chinese citizen without cause. It added that the Chinese government is steadfast in safeguarding the legitimate rights and interests of Chinese citizens. The Huawei CFO's detention is seen by China as a serious political incident. Just to retake that story once again, a court in Canada has just released a decision on the hearing of the case of the Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou. The judges ruled that the U.S. extradition case against the senior Chinese Huawei executive can proceed. Earlier on, China's foreign ministry had said that the United States and Canada had abused their bilateral extradition treaty and arbitrarily took compulsory measures against the Chinese citizen without cause. It added that the Chinese government is steadfast in safeguarding the legitimate rights and interests of Chinese citizens. The Huawei executive's detention is seen by China as a serious political incident. Moving on now, the easing of coronavirus-led restrictions does offer no relief, unfortunately, to Senegal's tourism industry. The sector, like many others in Africa, is heavily reliant on foreign travelers, and it could experience an extended struggle as a result of this pandemic. One hotel owner in a relatively popular tourist spot now says he hopes to attract more local traffic in order to make up for losses. CGTN's Beryl Oro explains why.
The Sin Salom region has escaped the worst of the pandemic that has so far infected 3,100 across the country. But the travel restrictions to contain the virus has hurt many residents who live off what they earned through the hospitality sector.
Welcome to the Cordon Bleu in Dangane at Sin Salom's doorstep, a little piece of heaven. Unfortunately, there are no tourists because of this international mess, so we are suffering like everyone else, and we are waiting for it to pass.
The revenue lost by the tourism industry globally is massive and is expected to extend into the foreseeable future. But thanks to the emergency loan from the Senegalese government, Lionel Lopez is able to keep paying his 15 employees a reduced wage.
Countries where tourists come from have put in place restrictions. For example, France, which produces the most tourists that come to Senegal. Clearly, people will go on holidays in France, so we won't have French people this summer. However, we are lucky to have an important customer base for the expat and the local community. We are waiting for the reopening on cross-region transport links in order to reopen the hotel. It is a good part of our income, 30 to 40%.
Across the silent lagoon of Marloge Island, others are not so lucky. Women who used to earn up to $17 a day selling woven baskets and carved souvenirs are struggling to support their families.
We've not sold anything in 2 months in the village. That's our only work. Women do that and men work in the land. With that, we can help out with the family.
Today we earn nothing. Sometimes we go fishing, so we earn a little selling the fish, but I would say 99% of our revenue is gone. What we should start doing is working on local tourism. I work a lot on that at the moment. We need to attract Senegalese living in Dakar or in other regions.
Even if international visitors are allowed to return soon, the over 2-month hiatus means tourist numbers this year will be far below the 1.7 million who were on holiday in Senegal in 2019. Beryl Oro, CGTN.
Now, as the COVID-19 pandemic does continue to inflict damage in East Africa's largest economy, ABSA's Kenyan subsidiary has restructured about 15% of its near $2 billion loan book. That amounts to roughly 30 billion shillings, about $283 million worth of loans, whose terms have been extended as cash flow among individuals and enterprises declines, or in some cases, like the tourism sector, disappears entirely. The bank reported a 12% year-on-year rise in its loan portfolio for the first quarter of 2020. Interest income from that was relatively flat, just under $52 million. Net earnings for the quarter rose by 1.8% to about $17.3 million. Now, the bank did hold over $770 million worth of government debt on its books at the end of the quarter. When I spoke to the ABSA Kenya managing director a few hours ago, I asked him if the bank had been formally approached with a proposal to defer interest payments on some of the government bonds in its portfolio.
I can say for us as ABSA, we've not been asked to push out interest payments or to accept interest payments at a future date. I know these ideas have been proposed. The Actuarial Society suggested that the payments be pushed out. And so the worry that I have is if you push that out, and government securities are a fairly significant proportion of the funds and the investments that those funds have made, that you could end up creating real problems for pensioners. And those are the very people, they live off their pension, you know. So I'm not sure how viable really it is for us to continue this. And the other thing is it could also be deemed as
a default. It's 5 quarters in a row, not by
mortgages. People generally will want to make sure they pay because they don't want to get into default and end up losing their property. I think in general, because of the environment, and I think it's more the uncertainty of the future environment, people are just sitting on the sidelines waiting to see how badly is this economy going to be hit, what prices are these assets going to be in the future. So you don't want to jump in now and then find housing prices are dropping, impacting your potential purchase price. So I think that could be more a function of supply and demand. And then you've got the sellers on the other hand saying, now isn't the ideal time to sell my property. So I think it's all those factors, but we haven't seen huge strain yet, at least in the short run. But our portfolio may not be fully representative of the entire mortgage market.
About 8%. Your dividend yield was the second highest, I believe, last year in the market among Kenyan banks. What's the thinking? I know this is a board level decision, but what's the thinking at the moment around paying out dividends this year? Because as you mentioned, there's a lot of uncertainty around how the economy will evolve, where the job market is heading, and how businesses will generally perform. It would be prudent in this market to hold on to cash, but shareholders may not necessarily see that argument.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a very topical subject. I'd say a number of things. I think the first is that banks are businesses like any other, and I think people sometimes forget that. Banks don't have they're not wholly responsible for underwriting the economy. So when they're looking at how they run their banks, as directors of banks, you have a fiduciary responsibility and a duty of care to protect the bank's assets, to protect the deposits of customers. So banks have to hold that capital in line with regulatory requirements. So if we start having much greater delinquency, much greater default and impairment, that starts eroding your capital base. Thankfully, I think for our market here in Kenya, our capital adequacy levels at the total capital level are sitting north of 17%. But we would expect through this crisis, it's inevitable impairments are going to increase, that capital number will start dropping down. So depending where your bank's capital adequacy levels are, they may see it prudent to retain capital to shore up their capital positions. Their capital also that they keep is also dependent on the risk-weighted assets they're going to book in the future. So if they don't see a big upswing in assets, they could maybe hold their capital levels correctly. But I think banks obviously need to manage risk. So the fact that you've seen a number of bank boards decide to hold back capital, I think just really shows prudence. But each bank has to make its decision around whether to pay dividends. So I think you can expect to see banks and institutions looking at what are their payout ratios to make sure that they come out strong and survive this crisis in a way without additional stress. It won't be easy for them to go and get new capital. If they've paid out the dividends, you run into capital problems, then you have to go back to the market. It's expensive, and you're probably going to have to go either through a rights issue or through going to Tier 2, and that Tier 2 could also be unpredictably more expensive than your Tier 1 capital.
Part of my conversation there with Jeremy Awori. Time for another break. Here's what's coming up shortly. China's political season wraps up with plans to eradicate poverty and renew prosperity for all. And the shipping industry is barely surviving with the effects of the pandemic ravaging spending.
Holding guns. Machine guns from police forces towards the protesters.
Were you worried about your life at that particular time?
Not at all.
Thank you very much for your time. What is your assessment of the state of the continent today?
Africa has the potential to power itself.
Excuse me.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Accra is my kind of city. That's because when I'm here, I feel like I'm back home in Lagos or Abidjan, which are two of the major cities I grew up in.
Business in Africa is high risk.
After about a decade covering business news on the continent, I've learned it's all about the high risk, but also the high returns and the high energy. You simply have to adjust in order to keep pace. When I started out as a journalist, my dream was to open people's minds to the different perspectives. From the CEO in the boardroom to the trader out in the street, we all have different stories. From Accra to Addis Ababa, from Cairo to Cape Town, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Here at CGTN, we realize that Africa is on the move, and it's moving fast, but we're moving right along with it. I'm Ucheo Koronkwo, and I'm a business anchor and reporter at CGTN.
China's top political advisory body has concluded its annual meeting in Beijing. Now, today we'll be featuring our 6th episode of the 2 sessions economic forum. The Chinese government is vowing to eliminate poverty by the end of 2020, despite all the difficulties caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang said in this year's government work report that eliminating poverty is an obligatory task that must be completed in order to build a moderately prosperous society.
China's poverty alleviation efforts have seen groundbreaking results since its reform and opening up measures in 1978. Over the past 4 decades, more than 850 million Chinese have risen above the poverty threshold, contributing 70% of global poverty reduction. Chinese President Xi Jinping has made poverty alleviation work a priority for the country. In 2013, he first proposed targeted poverty alleviation. And 2 years later, he set a deadline of 2020 to eradicate poverty in China. China's more developed eastern coastal regions saw their rural poor population plunge to 470,000 in 2019 from more than 13 million in 2012. That's a drop of 97%. Amid the sharp decline, the poverty incident rate stood at nearly 0. And in the same period, China's late-moving central and western regions also saw a significant drop, with a combined 5 million living under poverty by the end of 2019. And by the end of 2018, data shows that the poverty incident rate fell to 3.2% in western China and 1.8% in central China. The improvement of rural infrastructure has been a centerpiece of the nation's poverty alleviation efforts. By the end of 2018, over 99% of villages had access to telephones, while cable TV covered nearly 90% of villages. In the meantime, over 80% of villages had access to the internet broadband, and this has also promoted the online sales of agricultural products. E-commerce and live streaming are now instrumental in poverty relief. Also, more than 80% of villages had paved main roads, and over 50% had bus services. Also worth noting is that a large number of counties were officially removed from the list of poor counties. As a result of the precision measures, the number of counties lifted out of poverty grew more than tenfold, from just 28 in 2016 to 283 in 2018. Entering 2020, there are now under 200 days before China's own deadline for poverty alleviation. The COVID-19 epidemic this year impacted agricultural production and sales in rural areas. President Xi has urged the government to press ahead to achieve the goal of lifting all rural residents out of poverty by 2020.
The shipping sector around the world is still very much in troubled waters as this pandemic has forced a sharp decline in demand for raw materials and bulk items. CGTN's Mirilu reports from Singapore.
COVID-19 combat measures have reduced global economic activity and factory production, leading to a fall in demand for raw materials and bulk items and causing massive disruptions in the shipping industry.
Commercially, due to drop of demand for many products, with countries being in lockdown, it's pretty obvious that the container industry is facing tremendous difficulties, probably a 25-30% drop in demand and movement of containers. The dry bulk segment, which deals with iron ore, coal, grain, and the main bulk commodities, again due to lower demand, is suffering.
As a result, ships carrying cargo ranging from dry bulk goods to oil are either anchored at the main trading ports across the globe or drifting in international waters, waiting to be offloaded when demand resumes.
With the month of May being the absolute lows in terms of exports out of the main manufacturing hubs of Far East Asia. For instance, Far East into Europe peak at around 19% of the capacity that was otherwise scheduled, but has been blanked.
Caught in the middle of this crisis are the seafarers, 150,000 of whom are unable to return home due to airline disruptions and port restrictions.
We have called time and again on governments to address this issue, to classify seafarers as essential workers. We have developed a 12-step protocol for how to address the real specifics of dealing with crew change. And we call on governments to implement or to follow these procedures before we face a very, very serious crisis through mental illness, through fatigue, and so on, which could result in some terrible accidents.
The only silver lining has been the oil tankers. With warehouse shortage on land, an estimated 30% of oil tankers are currently being used as floating storage.
Price wars that have sent freight rates for crude oil tankers and also in most recent times oil product tankers sky high as supply and demand have been going in opposite directions. Many oil tankers were going into floating storage business as traders and refiners were basically scrambling to find enough storage to put the products and the crude oil into tanks.
Even as the world economies open up in the coming months, experts warn that the global supply chain might not return to pre-COVID times. And while shipping continues to be the mainstay for transporting essential items during the pandemic, the overall industry might only recover towards the second half of 2021. Miro Lu, CGTN, Singapore.
I'm sure many of you have thought about this at some point in time. Are robots perhaps the solution, maybe in the future, of parts, if not all, of our services sector? As tech-forward nations in the vanguard of automation, South Korea has recently adopted a crew of robotic baristas for its coffee shops. Take a look at what they're serving on What's Hot tonight.
The new barista at a cafe in Daejeon, South Korea is courteous and swift as it seamlessly makes its way towards customers. Lee Jong-min, a 35-year-old office worker, says his coffee tastes the same as ones made by human baristas. The robot barista is developed by a small factory solution provider in partnership with a state-run science institute.
Our system needs no input from people from order to delivery, and the tables were spaced apart to ensure smooth movement for the robots, which fits well with the current untact and distancing campaign.
The coffee-making robotic arm can make 60 different types of coffee, and the serving robot can deliver drinks to customers at their seats. The robot contains self-driving technology to plot the best routes around the cafe. An order of 6 drinks takes just 7 minutes to process. The only human employee at the 2-story cafe is a pastry chef who also has some cleaning duties and has to restock ingredients.
So we hear about automation a lot these days. I'm a bit worried about the job market as many of my friends are doing part-time jobs at cafes, and these robots would replace humans.
The manufacturer and the scientific institute aim to supply at least 30 cafes with similar robots this year. Lin, CGTN.
I don't know about you, but I still like being able to talk to my barista when I'm ordering my coffee, so that might be a bit of a problem. Still, that said, let's jump into the business of oil. So oil prices did fall a little bit earlier on in the session. Prices in New York actually did fall by about 6% or so a little earlier, but they did rally a little bit off the back of news that the Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, had spoken on the need to coordinate their activities with respect to trying to stabilize the market. A big chunk of the gains we're seeing in oil, both in WTI and Brent, has come off the back of the agreement to essentially cut output, and that has come off from OPEC+. Here's what's coming up next. When we return, we'll be exploring the business of producing eco-friendly wines in the Western Cape. And elsewhere in South Africa, the taxi industry is gearing up for eased COVID-19 restrictions.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Qanater, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to the program. Let's shift our focus to South Africa's Western Cape, where farmers and conservationists have come together to ensure that wine from the country is produced in an eco-friendly way. The idea here is to ensure that the entire process of production, from the farm to the winery, saves water, energy and cuts emissions in the process. Here's CGTN's Travis Andrews with that story on Grassroots tonight.
If you fancy a tipple and you are an environmentally conscious drinker, then Western Cape wineries may have something for you. Wines that are grown in a sustainable and eco-friendly manner. Conservation wine farming is taking root in South Africa. It made wineries sustainable while protecting the environment. The World Wildlife Fund South Africa is working with several estates to popularize conservation wine farming across the industry so that more farms adopt it.
Just over 40 farms that are on board with us now as conservation champions, and they really are the environmental leaders in the industry. We don't ask a membership fee for members to join because we encourage them to invest in the environmental aspects on their farm. A lot of these activities like alien clearing or restoring river areas or investing in renewable energy, those all require investment. So we'd rather they use their financial resources for those activities.
And they're doing that in different ways. Some have used animals like sheep to get rid of pests from their vineyards, while others are using indigenous teas like rooibos to make their wines. Some have even gone completely carbon neutral, and others have utilized the effects of runaway fires to clear their estates.
The big fire of 2000 left us quite devastated. It burnt down the complete Siemensburg and it actually jumped the road and devastated the Klappenskop. And it was after this incredible fire that set us in motion to actually do something about conservation. If it wasn't for that incredible disaster, we wouldn't actually be in conservation in the way we are today. We had someone walk up the Klappenskop, which was completely covered in aliens at the time, and after the fire, for the first time, we realized there was a 300-year-old yellowwood forest up there, and there was fynbos coming out, which was quite rare.
Conservation wine farming, however, increases operational costs for wineries already burdened with massive financial constraints. However, those in the campaign see the bigger picture of a far broader market of drinkers who are changing with the times. The wines that are grown here in the Cape Floral Kingdom grow amongst 9,500 species of plants, 70% of which grow nowhere else in the world. And it is this massive biodiversity that is increasingly leading more wineries to take conservational wine farming far more seriously. Rose Andrews, CGTN, Cape Town.
And still in South Africa, the taxi industry there is stepping up safety measures as the country prepares to downgrade its COVID-19 lockdown to level 3. The number of coronavirus cases has rocketed past 21,000. More than 10,000 people, however, have recovered, but the number of deaths is more than 400. The rate is expected to continue climbing, however, the peak only expected to come in months ahead. Here's CGTN's Julie Shire with this report.
Taxis aren't the safest mode of transport in South Africa, but they're the cheapest and most popular. The industry is doing all it can to keep passengers and drivers safe from COVID-19. Wearing masks and hand cleaning is compulsory. Sanitizing booths are now being included to boost protection.
It's a simple technology that does not require a lot of things. You don't even stand inside, you just walk through slowly and it immediately disinfects you. It is very necessary to put this precaution in place because we want to flatten the curve first of all, and this big rank like this one, these are the big hubs rank where a lot of people they interchange, you know, they're coming from townships.
This is the new reality for thousands of taxi rank passengers being sanitized from tip to toe, all in the hope to curb the spread of the virus.
I feel very safe because the taxi industry is actually following the rules and the regulations of the COVID-19. The government is putting pressure on them. That is why everywhere you go, you see there's booth, there's sanitizers, there's everything.
I think it's a good one. They should do it even in deep slot, in these rural areas. They should try using it everywhere. So in deep slot, we just sanitize our hands. We need to get something like this. That will be much safer.
Other precautions include driver screenings and regular disinfecting of vehicles and ranks.
We've been cleaning the rank thoroughly and make sure that the rank is clean, and also disinfecting the vehicle itself, inside and outside. And we've also educated our drivers and queue marshal that inside the vehicle where there's handles, they must carry on disinfecting the handles of the vehicles and inside the taxis.
In general, taxi drivers are in danger of transporting people every day.
It's so overwhelming. If we can all follow the precautions that we've been given by our leaders. Wear your mask, leave the house only if you have to for essential stuff. And then maybe we can be able to go back to our normal life sooner than later.
Millions are expected to be on the move again as restrictions ease in June. The industry is hoping measures taken will prevent further infections. Julie Shah, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Quick run through the currencies as we wrap up the program. Kenya Central Bank held its rate-setting meeting today. It left its policy rate essentially unchanged, 7%. Non-performing loans as a percentage of the entire portfolio, though, that was up 60 basis points to 13.1% in the month of April. Now, even amidst this pandemic, lending to the private sector did display a bit of interesting growth. It rose by 9% in the year to April. Lending to manufacturing and trade up 20% and 10.3% respectively. There is a credit guarantee scheme that is being planned, but the precise details on how it will work, how much is going to be provided, those are yet to be firmly announced. That's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen on the program in the last hour or so. There are many ways to get your thoughts back to us. All of them are on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The news continues on CGTN.